Hello, my name is Christine Caldwell, and I'm going to be your lecturer today on the topic of addiction. And welcome. Glad you're signed up for this particular class. It's really close to my heart. Just to say, I'll be sort of reading from some notes over here, so my head will be going this way as I speak for the next hour on this really important topic. And just to say a little bit about myself as we get started, I am a professor emeritus at Naropa University, where I taught for about 40 years and directed the somatic psychology program, both in dance therapy and in body psychotherapy. And it was while I was in my PhD internship that I had a placement in an addictions recovery center. And this is how I got started on the topic of addiction and the specialization of addiction, particularly as it pertains to the body. And so I'll be talking about that today, and that is also where my first book came from, which is called Getting Our Bodies Back. So I have also had over the years personal struggles with food, and so not only have worked with folks struggling with addiction, but also have watched that experience in myself as well. So today, I want to talk about what we're going to cover, and we're going to be looking at theories of addiction because they really matter. They really matter in terms of how you orient for treatment, what you believe about what addiction is and how it operates. So we'll just really briefly look at that. Then we're going to be able to see addiction from a somatic lens, and then look at it somatically in terms of a clinical question and clinical process. So along the way, we'll be looking at strategies for working with addiction and some tips about that. Okay, so let's go ahead and start, and I'll be starting now with theories of addiction. And so many of you might know portions of this, and so that's why I think I'll go through it very quickly. But one of the first sort of modern theories of addiction that began in the late 1800s, but mostly the early 1900s, was that addiction was a kind of a character flaw, or it was a moral failing. I mean, they actually said it was a moral failing, that people just didn't have enough willpower, they were weak, their character was weak. And so that's the first theory of addiction. The second model is the disease model. So saying that addiction is a disease like any other, and that we need to use that lens in order to understand what's going on and work with treatment. Then there's a third sort of more recent idea about addiction, and that it's called the choice model. And so I'm going to go into that in all of these in a little bit more detail in a minute, but it's about the choice model is saying that addiction is really a kind of learned and habitual repetition of thoughts and behaviors that causes a narrowing tunnel of attention and attraction. And so, in other words, it's a choice that you kind of fall into, and then it has these results in how attention works for you, what you pay attention to, what you don't pay attention to, and attraction, what you're attracted to and how you deal with attraction. So Let's first, though, take a little bit of a sidestep and go to the National Institute of Health's definition of addiction. So it says that it's a chronic, relapsing brain disease characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite harmful consequences. So they are talking about drugs. However, National Institute of Health does acknowledge that there are also behavioral addictions that operate in much the same manner. But notice that NIH is really very interested in and sort of doubling down on the idea of the disease model. It really sees it as a brain disease. Now, interestingly enough, neuroscience has started to weigh in on addiction and the different models of addiction. And some of the really interesting findings are, one, that addiction does alter the brain, and we'll go through that in a few minutes, but that also it alters the brain in the sort of classic areas where we look at the areas of the brain that are associated with pleasure and reward, but it also alters the body's organization of how it moves. Now, is that interesting or what for us as somatic people? So, in other words, some of the findings of these neuroscientists were that addiction could be, from a brain standpoint, called a programmed reach. Is that really interesting or what? So in other words, there's this feeling that I see something exciting or interesting or that I have had pleasure from in the past. And there's this sense of I can't stop just reaching for it. It just gets really automatic. I know I felt that way around food. I would just find myself eating that thing, whatever it was, and not feel that I actually sat and gave it thought, gave it a choice, and was more conscious about it. So this idea of a programmed reach is going to come back into what we talk about as we move along. The origins of the word addiction is also, I think, really interesting. The word addict comes from Latin and means devoted habit. So in these historic times, they were really seeing this idea of habituation as involved in addiction. And certainly from a neuroscience standpoint, that is what we are finding in the brain. But also, I really want to talk today, particularly about the brain as another part of the body. It's not separate from the body. It's just one body part of many. And addiction is a whole body phenomenon. And particularly, we see addiction in the movement of the body, in the posture and the gestures and the movement behavior of ourselves and our clients. So that's where I'm going to go today. Let me also talk about some of what is thought of as the classic features of addiction. You might already know these, but I think we want to just review them real quickly so that when they come up again as what we're looking at in terms of clinical strategies, we'll pick up on that. So some of the classic features of addiction are that there's an inability to stop. There's a loss of control, a feeling of loss of control, that you're not in control of reaching for that substance, that behavior, that action, but also that thought, that recurring thought, or that recurring feeling that makes you almost in a washing machine. It's the same process. So another feature of addiction is that the person continues to use that behavior or substance even when there's negative consequences. And even when they know there's negative consequences, they continue to use. Also, there's a preoccupation with, particularly with substance abuse. In other words, when you're not using, you're thinking about using, you're thinking about and wondering when you're going to get it next, when you know, what your supply is, does somebody else have it? So there's this preoccupation with either the substance or the behavior or the internal state that you're addicted to. So there's changes in behavior. The people around you will talk about that. They will say that you're different, and they will be able to say how your changes in behavior are impacting them and how what they notice. And then another one is that there's an increasing use and tolerance. Now, part of that is a brain issue. I might be able to go into that, but it might not have time today. But there's an increasing use and tolerance. In other words, tolerance is when you have to use more and more of something in order to get the same pleasurable high. And so that goes for behaviors like gambling and sexuality and all of that, as well as substances, that there's an increasing tolerance, always wanting more. And there's a craving and withdrawal symptoms. So literally particularly with substance abuse, but also with behavioral issues like gambling, like thrill-seeking behavior, there's a sense of withdrawal, a kind of a letdown, a really oftentimes terrible physical feeling and emotional feeling when you're not using, that almost compels you to keep using because the symptoms of withdrawal and the cravings are so strong and so negative. And so we really have to pay attention to that, and when working with our clients, really deal with that. The last one is that there's a loss of interest in other people and other activities. So you're just increasingly focused more and more on the food, on whether or not you're eating, on the gambling, on the next time you can have sex, on a substance, etc. So there's this quality of nothing else matters anymore, which is very hard, of course, for our loved ones who feel like they're increasingly marginalized in that process. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is go into the models of addiction with more depth so that we can really unpack where we want to land, where you want to land in these models. So let's just briefly look at the moral failing model, even though I hope we all understand from the get-go that this is a terrible model, and it actually, as a predictive model, it doesn't even work, and it never did work. So let's just sort of dispense with this one pretty quickly. So the treatment for moral failing at the time was psychoanalysis, which was the only really established psychotherapy at the time. And so this is very long-term, it's very expensive, it's insight-based. You are digging around in your childhood to find out why you are now a moral failure. And the issue there is that, one, it is not an accessible form of treatment for just about anybody. You have to be, very well financially resourced and time resourced to engage in it. It wasn't inclusive of people that weren't white, male, middle class. It really, locked into that kind of identity politics. And it really it stigmatized the people in question. So it really created a sense of, I'm a failure. This is my internal flaw, and I have to buck up. I buck up by understanding what happened to me as a child. And again, that completely collapsed, failed, and actually was what sort of leveraged the next sort of development in theories of addiction, which came out of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so I, again, don't want to go into a lot of detail about that, but AA was really a godsend in terms of pushing back against this idea of moral failure, and also the issue of accessibility. And so AA, as you probably know, is always free, it's community-based, it's based in what then developed over time as the disease model. It looked at the issue of that you were powerless against the addiction, and that there were things you could do to counteract that powerlessness in order to recover. Now, the idea of recovery, however, in AA is a little iffy, because in classic AA terminology, you never fully recover. You are always an addict for the rest of your life. That's part of your identity, which is probably, to my mind, what one of the failures of, again, this development. But there are so many wonderful aspects to when AA came along, what it did for people. I think we are all very sure that it has saved millions of people's lives and really helped decrease a lot of suffering and has helped so many people. So we now want to look up, though, at what we can play with in terms of going forward and even getting more clear-cut and more precise understandings of addiction. So just to go back to the moral failing, it really also centered around a quality of shame for the person struggling with addictions, shame and self-blame. So that is another thing that really was actually, we find, is antithetical to treatment. And even AA counteracted that and said, no, feeling shame just makes you go back to using. And so there was a thing about forgiveness. There was a thing about a kind of spiritual support as well as community support that all really helped push back against the real horrible failures of the moral theory of addiction. So again, also the accessibility and the welcoming of anyone, regardless of who they were, was part of the process. And this is particularly true in terms of poverty and financial and social resources, that anybody was welcome. AA in the beginning really had a strong, of course, male-centric view. That was because at that time, in about the 1920s and 30s, it was focused on alcoholics, and most alcoholics were men at that point. And so it was sort of male focused and alcohol focused. But now, of course, it's really expanded and it's gotten very much more inclusive. So okay, but let's look now at the disease model. So this developed alongside Alcoholics Anonymous and was researched, particularly by neuroscientists and behavioral medicine people, and is currently the dominant, highly dominant theory of addiction. I'm sure many of you have been exposed to this idea that it's an addiction, it's a disease, and that we should see it, we should destigmatize addiction because it's a disease like any other, like having diabetes, and that by calling it a disease, we help people access treatment. And certainly this has given rise to huge billion-dollar industries of recovery centers, etc. And of course, very largely well-meaning and really working hard to help people recover. But there's a lot of money in the disease model. And so we want to kind of hold that idea. And so in the disease model, part of how it got started was neuroscientists did start to see how addiction changed the brain. And it also, there seemed to be some heritability of addiction. So it does somewhat run in families, and that's even when you take twins who have been raised apart. So there is some sense of heritability, although not as much as was thought originally. So we can keep our minds open about that, but there's not a whole lot of evidence that it is strongly heritable. So this, of course, reduced the stigma. Just like you don't feel the stigma of having diabetes, there's this sense of reducing the stigma by calling it a disease. And it, of course, helps people access rehabilitation centers and therapy much better. It is covered by many insurance policies, health insurance policies. And of course, AA and the 12-step program also feel that addiction is best thought of as a disease. So it kind of goes into, then it puts disease into a medical model, and that has an upside and a downside, as we can see. And well, let's go into the neuroscience a little bit more, because there's neuroscience really blossomed in the 1990s, and researchers found brain changes that were associated with addiction that seemed to validate the disease model, and the changes in centers of the brain that produce and manage dopamine. I suspect many of you already know, have a basic understanding of some of the pleasure and reward centers of the brain, which have the neurotransmitters associated with them are dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and a few others. But largely speaking, the brain changes that we were seeing in folks struggling with addiction was a lot centered on the dopamine system in the brain, which is about pleasure and reward. It's also, if you know a little bit of neuroscience, the striatum is the brain area that is very implicated there. Also the nucleus accumbens, but don't worry about that. Okay, so it also alters other areas of the brain, not just pleasure and reward centers. It also alters areas associated with judgment, decision-making, and self-control. So it really does get very vivid in terms of how it does change the brain. So some researchers called addiction this programmed reach at this point, where they were saying your body just organizes towards something. It's focused on and attentive to, and attention narrows. Everything is like tunneled, and it is tunneled toward what you are relating to in a manner that you lose a lot of control over. So, but again, what we'll come back to is how this is seems to be about the movement centers of the brain as well. So let's go into the third model, the choice model. And the choice model is championed by a particular author who is a neuroscientist and also has talked about his own addictions. and written several books. And let me get his name for you here. It's Mark Lewis. The book that he wrote about this is called The Biology of Desire, Why It's Not a Disease. And so he's coming on the scene now and talking about, as a neuroscientist and a former addict, talking about the downsides of the disease model. And so what he says is that addiction is a personal self-defeating habit, and that it involves self-medication that's grounded in developmental processes and developmental trauma. He says, he points out very accurately that PTSD and other often coexists with addiction. There's something like a 60% overlap between PTSD and addiction. And that most attractive experiences, most pleasant or attractive experiences, are going to create a motivation to repeat them. This is just the way our bodies work, a way any mammal will work and operate. Most animals actually work this way. Pretty much any animal with a nervous system is going to be wired up this way, that something that is attractive and pleasurable will kind of organize your system towards repeating it. Okay. And so, for instance, when we look at food, we can see that sugar has a kind of pleasant effect, at least in the beginning. And there's this, the more you eat, the more you want to eat it. Same with other types of foods like high fat or processed foods, etc. A lot of processed foods actually are now thought of as fairly addictive. Okay, so most attractive experiences will create a motivation to repeat them. And so what it does is it alters your sense of what desire is, and that it restricts the number of desires in a kind of developmental cascade. And it because drugs and other behaviors can kind of elevate your mood and decrease anxiety, at least in the short run. It relieves stress temporarily. And so it relies on neural plasticity, in other words, the ability of the brain to change. But remember, plasticity is actually throughout the body. It's not just neural. All systems of the body are plastic. They can change over time. It's just that we get real fascinated with neural plasticity. And so it relies on neuroplasticity, but it also reduces neuroplasticity. And this is one of the things that I really want to focus on in our time together, is that what happens in addiction is that behavior gets more stereotyped, more simple, less creative, and more predictable. And so this kind of narrowing of attention, narrowing of what you're interested in, really helps you to become much more sort of predictable and stereotyped in behavior and in thought and in feeling. And actually, when I was working in the Addictions Recovery Center, this was amazing to me how much people in recovery were talking about this, and talking about how gray and boring their life felt without the drug, and in my case, in terms of the internship I was in. So all of that results in a loss of control over your thoughts and your behaviors. And so the treatment from the choice model is effort and insight. One of the things that Lewis talks about is how we all have to find out what works for us. So this is a model that's much more open in terms of how you understand what's going to work for you in terms of treatment. And it's, for instance, though, he talks about cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational interviewing, all as good strategies that many folks struggling with addiction have benefited from, and that really, in a sense, work alongside this choice model. Now, the choice model, you know, we can go, whoa, choice, you know, it's like, do you think I'm actually choosing this? I don't feel like I'm at choice. And this is kind of a interesting tension that I think that this model creates, because what Lewis says is that we make a mistake when we think choice is a very cognitive process, that choice is actually occurring through motivational centers in the brain. In other words, I choose what I am motivated to go towards or away from, to approach or avoid. And so there's this sense of that addiction happens in this model from that repeated sort of going towards that, that easy motivation, that like easy pleasure, that substance or behavior that that increases the dopamine and helps you feel pleasant, and you haven't really, you know, done anything to in a sense, organize that. You've allowed a drug or a behavior to force that pleasure, that dopamine release. And so I call these unnatural pleasures. In other words, anytime that you are relying on an external substance or a particular behavior or thought as a way to find pleasure, and getting locked into that, you habituate to that. And that's sort of part of this choice model. So in the choice model, they talk about how the brain, yes, the brain does change with addiction, but brains change all the time. Brains change with any experience that we have. This is actually, neuroscience is very clear about this as well. Any experience changes your brain. So addiction is just one way that the brain changes, one of many. Learning is a brain change, for instance. Learning is actually, you know, happening when neurotransmitters shift, when neurons shift, etc. So they're saying, yeah, you know, the disease model is right, that it is a change in the brain, but that's not the important point, is I think what they're saying. So they even say, you know, the brain changes when you fall in love, for instance. So calling it a disease, they feel, is harmful, can be harmful. So many addicts don't see themselves as ill, and in the same sense of that medical sense of illness. Excuse me. This is hard for people to feel a sense of self-authority, self-efficacy, or the ability to sort of be basically in charge of their lives. So for instance, AA really relies on you admitting your powerlessness. And most addicts in recovery really stress things like empowerment, the sense of feeling, again, like I can alter how I'm choosing. And so this choice model is this idea of self-empowerment, and what will give you that self-empowerment so that you don't keep reaching, literally keep reaching for that habituated motivated response. And so particularly when we're looking at marginalized identities and marginalized populations. This sense of empowerment can be really important and really, in a sense, have a more socially just perspective than I have a disease and I'm out of, it's, yes, it's not my fault, but there's also a sense of powerlessness there. So particularly like about recovery. For instance, there's evidence that many addicts recover on their own without any kind of treatment. They saw this they first studied it in Vietnam vets that were returning home from the war who had been addicted to heroin over in Vietnam. And when they came home and they got their families back, they got their social connections back and their lives back, that something like 3/4 of them just stopped using heroin. And so this was the first evidence that in some cases, significant number of addicts will recover on their own. And so that sort of challenges the disease model, right? It kind of challenges that. So there's a debate over moderation versus abstinence. So for instance, in the AA model and in the disease model, since you have the disease for your whole life and you have to be totally abstinent. And there is some evidence that people can recover from addictions, such as, for instance, sex addiction. You can get a sex life back even after feeling that you are recovered from sex addiction. And so there's a quality, for instance, like also around food. We have to eat food. And so when you're addicted to certain foods or eating patterns, how do you work with that? Because there's no way to be abstinent from food. So the complexity of the issue here is part of what we want to take on. And so it's very fraught and contentious, this debate about moderation versus abstinence. And so just be aware of that. And that might be with your clients part of the choices that they are really trying to make very consciously and very deliberately and experiment with in treatment. So again, this choice model challenges the idea that addiction is a lifelong condition. There's a famous study that they cite a lot, and I've seen this, references to this study for, 20 or 30 years, where they were working with rats in a lab, and rats in cages that were living in cages and never out of cages in these very restrictive and in environments that were very harsh and, what's the word? Not creative at all, let's put it that way. So the rats in cages that are offered heroin or water tend to choose the heroin. But rats that live more out in the open and with each other in complex social and physical environments that get to play and interact and have a quote unquote kind of normal life will choose water instead of heroin. And so this and other experiments like that seem to also challenge the disease model and really help us to see that social connection matters, that living a life that is what we might call a natural life is a very important part of this process. So also behavioral addictions get really slippery in the disease model, right? So if you are in a disease model, it's hard to understand behavioral addictions well, and addictions particularly to emotional states and cognitive states. And so, for instance, compulsion and obsession. And so we know this from like DSM and things like that, obsession compulsion disorders actually work with the same brain areas as addiction. And so this is pointed out by this choice model and says that we really want to take a fresh look, a different look. So in this idea of choice, though, is that the idea of choice is that there's a change in your thought process that seems rational at the time, but is actually, again, coming from a brain center that's about reaching for something and getting more and more habituated toward reaching for something that isn't good for you. So it's they point out that choice is actually not rational, that it works from the same brain areas as we have for hope and interest and motivation. And so it's not necessarily coming from rationality or empowerment. And so that's how we want to understand these models. And so let's look at when we start to understand our clients in their struggles with addiction, looking at addiction or looking at our client through these different lenses. What lens do you look through to be of most service to your client's recovery? So taking on the disease model, maybe that is the best choice that that client is going to have right now, or this choice model might be the best way to look at it. So let's move on, because I want to now go into addiction and the body. And I will encourage you actually also to really feel this in your own body. I've done this by, for instance, putting out one of my favorite little candies or a chocolate or something in front of me on a table, and just have a feeling for a moment about what it feels like to reach for it and what it feels like to inhibit a reach for it. And so that's an exercise I do with a lot of clients, and help them really locate in their body that sense of kind of going towards something and everything else kind of fading away and everything is about that. Or what it feels like, what it brings up that you can work with them about, what it brings up when they inhibit the reach and sit and maybe look at the piece of chocolate or whatever and not reach for it. So this is sort of a preview of one of our clinical strategies. The other exercise that I will do with clients is to actually have them do a kind of an imagery exercise where they can imagine themselves as a child and imagine themselves like just waking up from a nap and reaching for mom or dad or their caretaker and, come get me, I'm ready, I want to be with you, and reach for that and feel the sense of what it's like when nobody comes, when there's no response to that, there's no attuned response to that. And then do the exercise again with the image of that response being answered, that person coming. There's a sense of being held, of being attuned to, and being answered for that. And this is something that can be very powerful to start to uncover how the person has gotten tangled up with the habit that's associated with the addiction. Okay, so again, now we're going to go into this somatic element. And again, we're going to talk about the whole body as being involved in the addictive process, not just the brain. So the whole body changes, again, behavior changes, tension patterns in the body change, posture changes, movement changes, and unfortunately, it all gets a little bit more constrained. Behavioral creativity starts to diminish, and life gets kind of dull and lifeless. There's a lot of depression that goes along with addiction, and this is because there's a lack of curiosity, experimentation, and creativity that goes along with this habit. That's the downside of any habit. And so when I was working with addicts in this recovery center, I really came to see that addiction was, in a sense, a kind of somatic dissociation. And so what I was noticing was I would be working with a client, some kind of feeling might come up. You would start to see them get, let's say, a little bit of emotional or a little bit changed by something that they were saying or experiencing. And then all of a sudden it would just like, yeah, well, let's talk about something else. And so there was this almost abrupt shift. You could see where the person began to want to dissociate from what they were directly experiencing, from what they were feeling. And I got kind of snarky in there, and embarrassed to say that I was very snarky about it, because I was starting to be able to predict when that would happen. And I would start to see, and I thought, okay, he's starting to feel something. He's going to scratch his head and want to change the subject in the next 30 seconds. And unfortunately, I was accurate a lot of the time. And it took me a while to realize that what was happening for me was that it was just very difficult clinically to watch people abandon their direct experience and go toward a kind of habit of distraction and dissociation from their bodily experience. And so I got curious about that. I got curious about my own response, and I got curious about their responses. And I started to notice what I called tags, these little kind of movements, rubbing of the fingers, a squeezing of the eyes, a jaw tightening, very tiny little, what I now call micro movements, that the client was making as a way to actually get the job done of dissociating from a direct experience. So the body has to do something to stop feeling what it's feeling. And so I was watching for and identifying how this particular person, what they would do to stop a threatening experience that they were having. And I was seeing this as part all wound up in their addiction and addiction recovery. So again, addiction makes behavior more predictable and more stereotyped. And I was seeing this also as part of my experience, where I felt that it was hard to help a client sustain things like curiosity and creativity and inquiry and experimentation, that was threatening, actually. So this idea, again, from the Latin root of the word addiction, of a devoted habit, really made sense to me. And of course, the other thing here is that we all struggle with that, right? We all have devoted habits. We all, not everybody is addicted to fentanyl or methamphetamine. We can be addicted to screens and how much we check our cell phones. And this is actually a very not talked enough about issue, how addicted we are to screens. Also, there's been some research done about pornography, about watching pornography online, that it has the same features of addiction, that people have to do more and more of it to get the same high from it. And also what's quite disturbing with pornography is that in order to get the same high, the same excitement from the experience of watching porn, they also have to get more and more edgy. And so you see people starting to go towards porn that is violent or involves children, or really some very disturbing sexual behaviors. This was very well talked about in a book called The Brain That Changes Itself. I believe the author is Doidge, D-O-I-D-G-E. It's an excellent book on neuroplasticity and the sort of upside and downside of neuroplasticity. So we all struggle with things that are easy. We all have things that are somewhat easy to resist in terms of temptations or toxins that we might be exposed to, and then things that are harder for us, that are more challenging and that we struggle with, and that we have problematic relationships to. So it's not like there are these addicts out there and then there's us or other people. We're really all along a spectrum of addiction. And so I like to work with this idea of a spectrum of addiction. And so from mild to life-threatening. And so mild is just that your life is getting a little bit dull, it's getting a little stereotyped, you find yourself doing the same things over and over, and you feel a little bit trapped by that. And then down here, of course, there's life-threatening, oftentimes substance abuse, but also high-risk behaviors that are both life-threatening and really terrible for those around you as well. So addiction is along a continuum, and that's one thing we have to, I think, really appreciate clinically, is that a lot of times the disease model is, you have it or you don't. And so there's this almost on-off switch that you can get into a mindset about. And I think looking at addiction along a continuum is much more useful clinically for us. And so you can sort of get a feeling for where someone is along a continuum, and they have multiple continuums there, because a continuum around behaviors, a continuum around foods, a continuum around substances, etc. So, and how you work with them, in a sense, is attuned to where they are on that continuum. Okay, so, it can be all the way from a feeling of total loss of control, you don't even know who you are anymore, to just feeling a little bit stuck. So and again, the other way that I would like us to play here is that we want to expand our notion of addiction to anything that we feel stuck to or out of control about. So that includes thinking, emotions, things that we feel sort of compulsed to do or compulsed not to do. And so there's this sense that we can actually become addicted to our own neurotransmitters. We can become addicted to our own adrenaline. We can become addicted to stress, other stress hormones. And so there's this sense of, again, the whole body having metabolic set points that we can habituate to for various reasons. And so we want to get a sense clinically of how the client's whole body is really participating in this addictive process, and look at it from a whole body perspective in terms of treatment. So recovery is also more than abstinence. So I really want to stress that some clients will need to be abstinent, at least for part of their recovery. And I don't want to discourage anyone from, for instance, going to AA meetings. or NA meetings or whatever. Literally, it can save people's lives, and it can be really important, particularly in terms of social support and community support. But recovery is more, to me, is more than abstinence. It also involves finding your way back to simple, natural pleasures, particularly pleasures of the body in an ongoing way. And so addiction is, in a sense, what I call an unnatural pleasure, a forced pleasure, if we talk about dopamine, which is, for instance, a drug of abuse forces a lot more dopamine than is natural into the synapse, and it keeps it in the synapse longer than what is natural. And that's how we get the feeling of high or pleasure, is that kind of forcing of dopamine. And of course, what it does is it exhausts the dopamine system. And that's how you get then having to apply more intensity in order to get that same effect. So the important thing then is not just to stop forcing the dopamine, but to reestablish natural, normal, day in, day out, what I call natural pleasures. And of course, these are the pleasures of the senses, the pleasures of the body actually directly experiencing life. And so part of what I want to encourage you to do with your clients is not only work on the causes and the results of the addiction, but to realize that a lot of treatment is going to be organized around helping them find normal, natural pleasures, particularly the pleasures of the senses. So what it's like to feel a smooth fabric along your skin, or what it's like to just touch your hand, or what it's like to hold someone, what it's like to look at a beautiful sunset, or what it's like to listen to the wind in a tree. These kinds of things get lost in an addiction, and they need to be found again over and over and over to establish a kind of baseline dopamine system that is sort of low grade but constant. And this is what is actually predictive of well-being and a sense of happiness and empowerment, is this quality of the body producing natural pleasures and being really satisfied by those natural pleasures. So dopamine is, of course, this pleasure and reward, but dopamine also has another really important function in the body, and that's that dopamine coordinates movement. So for instance, we see in the disease of Parkinson's that Parkinson's is actually a disease of the degeneration of the dopamine system. And this is why you see tremors and uncontrolled movements in Parkinson's, and an inability to kind of initiate movement or sustain movement, because dopamine, and as do many neurotransmitters, has a dual function. And isn't this interesting that it has a function of coordinating movement? Because what I'm going to suggest is that with your clients, looking at movement and working through movement and leveraging movement as a way to work with this recovery of healthy dopamine regulation is an amazing way to go, and of course a highly somatic way to go. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So the treatment that I'm advocating for here involves exploring choice in movement and increasing natural pleasures, as well as the importance of social support, the importance of the acknowledgement of oppression and injustice in the ongoing treatment of addiction, and also that other resources such as AA, such as certain kinds of medicines, drug medicines, prescription medicines, or natural substances that can help with addiction. For instance, there's some really excellent research going on right now about addiction and psychedelic therapy, and different like MDMA, peyote, etc. So stay tuned on that. I would approach that cautiously, but with a lot of interest. There's certainly some really good findings coming out about that now. So again, we want to really be open-minded to all kinds of different ways that we support treatment for a client. But in the session itself, let's go back to this idea of movement and really helping the client to do things like to study just starting and stopping movement. So start leaning forward and then stop leaning forward, and just take a minute right now and feel that. So you stop moving. What kinds of associations come up? Does it feel kind of calming? Does it feel irritating? Do you have a memory come up with it? Does a feeling come up with it? All of these kinds of inquiries from different movement experiences are really critical to helping find one's way back to a well-regulated dopamine system. And so, again, I was talking about how I've had clients reach out and feel what associations come up to that and do all kinds of really incredible therapeutic work about that. Also, to inhibit movement and see what kinds of memories and associations they have to that. And so beginning also to encourage creative movement. So I've actually, put on music and danced with my clients. Of course, I'm also a dance therapist, so that is kind of natural. But I've also done just, letting oneself get a little goofy and kind of make faces and gestures, and when appropriate, to really help the client feel these kind of small natural pleasures in the body, and to really focus on that as a practice, much like a meditation practice, or the practice of getting enough exercise, or the practice of drinking enough water. This kind of exercise is critical for people struggling with addictions, that they have a kind of physically creative life. And so, and also this supportive of the support of natural pleasures. And so just the pleasures of touch, the pleasures of chewing something very consciously that one enjoys, very deliberately. So really staying awake to these tiny moments of natural pleasure are what I really want to sort of leave you with there. Infants and children actually regulate through movement. They move their bodies in certain ways to signal that they need support. They need something like food or attention or touch or whatever, that they need your body to help regulate their body. They signal that through sound and movement. Sound is a type of movement anyway. So one of the ways in which we can understand addiction developmentally is that when these different movements that infants and children are making are not attuned to and not answered well, it then creates a disconnect between this idea that how I move helps me get what I want. So in the beginning, that might be crying or reaching or getting agitated for an infant. And as you grow up, it includes being able to reach for the toy, reach for the cracker, and feel yourself drawing it to your body and putting it to your mouth, and that is a normal, natural pleasure. But if we get that kind of traumatic disconnect between how I move and a sense of kind of calm, steady empowerment, right? How I move helps me get through the day, helps me get what I want, helps me feel satisfied, etc. If there's any kind of disconnect with that, then that trauma really sets the stage for addiction. And so a lot of when we look at treatment, we want to really play with this idea of helping even practicing little movements about natural pleasures and the pleasure of different sensory experiences. And also the kind of regular therapeutic work you might want to do about when a person's memory is about not being answered, not being held, not being seen in terms of their bodily movement, in terms of their movement communication and their nonverbal communication, which is our first language. Okay, so the needs that people have, that babies have when they're signaling, they don't go away. And when they don't get answered, the baby will begin to dissociate, and they have to use their body to dissociate. And so this is where you'll see a lot of these self-soothing behaviors that I was picking up in adults in the treatment center, and that I was calling tags originally. And so, of course, all babies do self-soothing behaviors. It's actually really important to have self-soothing behaviors because the world can't give you everything all the time. But when there's a real neglect of getting one's needs met, the signaling system that occurs through movement, it degrades, and then the whole this sets up the dopamine system to be fragile and much more fraught in terms of how you become more susceptible to addictive processes. So what I do in treatment is I actually identify the small gestures, which I used to call tags, now I call micro movements. Watch for these in your client. Watch for them, and it might be here, it might be here, it might be, just looking down. It might be some kind of small gestural quality. The chest might just go down a little bit, or a shift in posture. These are all, in a sense, the leading edge of the client dissociating physically, but they're also the way home in terms of treatment. And so what I do is I very gently and very supportively ask the client to actually inhabit the tag consciously, inhabit that little micro movement consciously. So I'll have them go like this very deliberately, and then begin to report what comes up when they do that, when I clench my jaw just a little, or if I blink or squeeze my eyes, or if I tip my chin up a little bit, and I do that consciously, then what happens is that the tag can become the leading edge of some kind of creative movement that goes somewhere that the client can process. So I'm making this up now, but it might be something like this, or like this, or like this, or like this. And all of a sudden you've got very powerful material to work with that the client has been dissociating from physically. And so there, again, you would use all your strategies that for helping the client to just stay with the experience a little bit, process it, take a break from it. Don't try to, go all intensely into it. Yeah, it's very important to take breaks, what I call the oscillation of attention, the oscillation of entering the symptom and relieving the symptom. And so that the client actually feels like they have control over their experience. So if their experience goes out of control, then that is re-traumatizing. And so you do this kind of exploration of the movements that come up, And then you take little breaks from it. And then when the body starts to gesture again, you go back into it. Let's go back right into that. Just, yeah, really take care right there. Just be with that. This seems really important. Stay with that. See where it wants to go. Oh, so now it's squeezing. Yeah, just trust that. Oh, and now the squeezing goes into a fist. That's it. Stay with that. Yeah. And then, oh, your hand's just open. Let's take a break for a minute. And so this quality of really allowing the movement to tell the story of how this habit got started, how this kind of squeezing down of choice got started is our clinical work. So we want to encourage, as I go toward the end of our time together here, we want to encourage a sense of bodily autonomy, that they can feel that they are really in charge of their physical experience, that they know how to exit something that's really threatening, and that they know how to also touch it and be with it in increasing dosages, and that also that they have a practice of natural pleasures. And of course, this bodily authority involves really being able to track and work with sensations in the body, on the surface of the body, but also outside the body. Vision and hearing are one of the senses as well. And we want to really help the client, who almost always feels shame around addiction, to practice non-judgmental attention, non-judgmental awareness. So I notice my fingers doing this. Oh, let's stay curious with that. This might be really a signal that we want to pay attention to. Yeah, stay with that. Okay, let's go. Yep, let's go away from it now, and let's come back to it. I think there's something really important here. So really to help them push back against the habit of shaming their direct experience because it has been threatening before. And so the other clinical strategy I'd recommend is to actually have them practice inhibiting movement. And so particularly inhibiting reaching, or inhibiting some kind of really common movement gesture that you see them doing, both doing it very deliberately and then inhibiting it very deliberately, and then talking about what comes up when you do that as an experiment. So you do the little movements deliberately, and then you study what comes up. But when the client feels the stress of a direct experience coming up, this is where what I call the therapeutic triangle comes in. So the therapeutic triangle is breathing, moving, and sensing. So this is how a client stays associated rather than dissociated. So really encourage the client to support just conscious breathing. Doesn't have to be deep breathing, just conscious breathing, conscious moving in their body. It doesn't have to be anything big or, cool looking. And conscious tracking of sensation. This is one of the most important practices that we can give to our clients as part of their recovery. We want to also call out shame responses as a type of poorly designed attempt at self-control. So a lot of times people will use shame as a way to sort of dysfunctionally try to stop themselves from doing something. And of course, it's really an ineffective way to do that. So make sure to call out when that self-critic emerges. And just saying, there's your critic, there comes the critic. The critic comes up at that border when they are used to and habituated to dissociating from their direct experience. And so sometimes that calling out can help them not just default into that shame. And so you want to push back against that by establishing habits between the two of you of empathic responsibility, curiosity, empowerment. So you also want to uncover associations that I've talked about to some of these habits the bodily habits that the client has engaged in, because the bodily habits support what other habits the client is struggling with. And so these associations that come up can be memories, images, sounds, words, sensations, emotions. Welcome those as a message from their unconscious, as a message from the past that clues us into what are the triggers for addiction and what we can do to work more creatively with that. And so we also want to practice appreciations. AA used to call them affirmations. I like to call them appreciations. So it's very important to really acknowledge and to say, oh, I saw you tolerating that feeling of grief just a little bit longer. That feels so important. And I just want to say, I really noticed that you were able to breathe into that experience a little bit longer today. So really making appreciation part of the experience. In a sense, it's it's another natural pleasure. Also, just take deliberate steps to strengthen relational connection. So sometimes I'll just literally challenge a client to sit with me and just have us look at each other for a minute, have us breathe together. Sometimes I'll ask if I can hold their hand for a minute, but to really feel that they're not alone is an important part of recovery from that narrowing into the habit of only paying attention to the addictive process. And so also taking steps to combat powerlessness, whether that's micro activisms in the world, which is a term coined by my friend and colleague Ray Johnson from their book called Embodied Activism. So different ways that they can be involved in being active in their lives, being engaged in their lives, choosing to do things in their lives. This is very important. It could be volunteering. It could be, again, just little micro activisms, but to really encourage that sense of re-empowerment. So since we all have these ongoing experiences of getting caught in dysfunctional habits, this really gives us a leg up to working with addiction treatment with clients, because again, addiction is along this continuum and we all are on that continuum. And so partly, I think one thing I want to leave you with is this appreciation for you being willing to take a look at addiction in this different way, for you being willing to see us all in that same human boat of the upside and the downside of habituation, and also our ability to really be with our direct experience and our creative process as a means of recovery from anywhere along that continuum. And so again, I just want to appreciate you for that and for chewing on these ideas. If you want to receive a copy of these notes, so I have 9 pages of notes here, happy to share with you. Or I also have an original published article about some of the aspects of particularly the developmental part of this process. It's called Addiction as Somatic Dissociation. I'd be happy to share that with you. Please contact me through my websites. So my first website is themovingcycle.com. That's the therapeutic work I do, which is called The Moving Cycle. And the other is the website associated with my latest book, which is called Conscious Moving. And so the second website is consciousmoving.com. And so you can contact me through either of those websites. I'd be happy to send you resources. So thank you again, and be well. And I look forward to hearing about your work in this field. It's a wonderful, such a contributive area of work, and one that I think we don't talk about enough. So thank you for this, and thank you for today. Bye-bye.